the people of sake actually brought me into sake.
Back in 1988, this place was actually in Ginza on the main drag.
At first it was kind of soy sauce, it was miso.
To the point where it actually changed my life.
New Year's Day 1989.
Not just sake as a beverage, but all the culture and history.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Sake on Air. For those of you that are tuning into us for the first time, this podcast is just about sharing kind of our experiences as people working as professionals in the sake industry. I think a lot of us were kind of hooked by the kind of stories that are out there about sake, and this is an opportunity to share those with you and some insight from Japan that maybe you can't get hold of where you are. And in today's show, we are going to be going on a voyage of discovery and sniffing our way into the aroma of sake. What does sake smell like? And how does it compare to, say, wine or beer or any other alcoholic beverages out there? And I think this is definitely going to be a show to have a glass or two or three or maybe more sake in front of you while you're listening. And perhaps do your own little smelling test as well while you're listening. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce my cast. My name is Chris. I will be hosting the show for this episode, and I am joined by, on my right-hand side,
Rebekah Wilson-Lye.
Hey, Rebekah.
Nice to see you again, Chris.
Yeah,
Looking forward to tonight's topic.
Likewise, it's very nice to have you on the show. And on my left, I am joined by
Sebastie Lemoine.
Sebastian.
Nice to be here.
Yeah, we were just doing an event yesterday, weren't we?
Yes.
It was a lot of fun to work with you for the
related.
first time, I think, actually. Do
That's
an
right.
event together.
Enjoyed that tremendously.
Yeah, likewise. But without further ado, let's dive into this episode's topic, aroma. Where do we start on aroma?
Well, first question I want to ask is aroma good or not?
I would personally say that I think it depends on the person, on their sense of smell, and also preference as well. What do you think, Rebekah?
Well, I believe that, I don't know the exact percentage of it. I'm sure that someone can Wikipedia it and find the correct answer. But I believe that around about 80% of our sense of flavour is actually coming from our sense of smell. So flavour doesn't really happen without aroma.
Yeah, that's a
Agree
really
with
good
that.
point. So if we start by explaining basically what we mean when we refer to aroma, first of all, you have taste and you have flavor. And there are two different things, right? And actually, it's interesting because in Japanese, they don't separate them. They just have one word for both, in a sense. But so we were discussing this earlier. And basically, so you both would sum up flavor as being a combination of taste and aroma together, basically. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay. So taste is basically things like bitterness and saltiness, sourness, umami, right? The things that you pick up
And
on your tongue. Sweetness as well, of course. And then basically flavor is things like apple, banana, chestnut, cereal-based things, milky things, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. And a lot of people, when they're actually tasting those flavors, if they're not used to tasting sake, or if they're not used to tasting in general, they might think those are tastes that you pick up on the tongue, because most people don't realize that actually flavor is picked up in our olfactory sensors, which are located in our nose. So, okay, so having kind of, established the difference between taste and flavor, so everyone knows what we're talking about when we talk about aroma in this show, can I just kind of ask both of you how you would sort of sum up sake in your own words? If someone was to ask you, what is the aroma of sake? How would you describe that?
Gosh, can you describe a spectrum? I think there are many misconceptions about sake. Number one, that it tastes the same, right? Everyone thinks it tastes the same. And I guess most people also would assume it smells the same. My first experience of sake pre-Japan were pretty heinous. I thought that sake smelt like cooking sherry. That's what it smelt like. Obviously, I didn't know much about sake, and neither did the people that were serving it to me, obviously. But I had a very, very narrow image of what sake's aroma and flavor was. Having come to Japan, having started my sake journey 15 years ago, I quickly discovered the wealth and the breadth of flavor, and hand in hand, the wealth and the depth of aromas that sake could possess, and how those aromas can therefore change with time and maturation, how they can change the same sake in the same bottle. The aroma can change based on the temperature that sake is served at. It can change on the glassware that you enjoy the sake with. It can change whether that bottle has been open for 1 day or 1 week. So I discovered this incredible spectrum of aroma, which is fascinating, and I think it's really underexplored. We talk a lot about flavor with sake, but I think aroma is something which is a really, really beautiful aspect of the tasting and enjoyment process of drinking sake.
Which aromas in particular sort of always get you excited when you can pick them up?
Well, it changes.
Yeah.
When I first arrived, I was, had my training wheels on, and I enjoyed the easy to understand aromas, the ones that were, peach, melon, apple, banana. Then as I started to explore more, I started to understand that those savory notes were compelling, because the savory notes were the sort of the harbinger of a rich, flavorful sake that was going to come. For me, that the aroma is the promise of what will be delivered in the mouth, and that gets me excited. And I, for a long time actually, I really liked namahine, which is
I love it actually.
The off aroma of an unpasteurized sake.
That's right.
It's got a bacony kind of geranium leaf, a bit of a sort of musty, almost like animal aroma. I don't know why, but it had me every time. My eyes rolled back in my head. It was like catnip for me. I loved it. Now I've moved on to another stage, and I think that's the same with the flavors that we appreciate as well. I find that what I'm enjoying in terms of aroma and flavor is changing as I change. It changes as the seasons change. It changes with what I'm eating or how I'm feeling. So
What you had the day before.
Yeah, what you had the day before. Yeah, that's true.
Food pairing is definitely key here, isn't it?
One point to complement what Rebekah was saying earlier, you were talking about a promise of what the sake will deliver in the mouth. And it's true that in sake very often we find a very strong consistency between the aroma that we perceive through the nose, so in the orthonasal way, and the aromas or the flavors that we perceive when the sake is on the tongue in the mouth, and you don't necessarily have that in all alcoholic beverages.
And that's actually rated very highly in the competitions, isn't it? So when you actually go and you judge sake in the competition, which I actually did very recently, all the time I was just talking about, just look for the balance between the aroma and the actual flavors.
As you are aware, I'm an IWC judge, and actually we judge, I would say, 95% on the nose. So we're going through 1,500 sake. We're going through a lot of sake, so we have to be quick and we have to be precise. And you're really reading the nose. The nose is going to tell you a lot about what's in the glass. You make your first initial thoughts. You gather, okay, this is what I feel is going to be coming. This is what this aroma is. I'm picking up these points. I'm expecting that probably on the mouth, and then you confirm in the mouth.
Yeah.
Right? If you're picking up a fault or something that might be less than perfect, you're also wanting to confirm that in the mouth. So your aroma is giving you all of the information. Yeah. The mouth is confirming that information in some cases.
Do you ever find that the aroma kind of throws you off? So you do.
Well, exactly to your point of balance. For me, I do find it disconcerting when the aroma is completely disconnected from the palate. If there isn't this collaboration between what is promised on the nose and delivered on the mouth, it's an unusual experience. You feel like, oh, that's not what I was expecting.
It's like going to the movies, maybe, after watching one of those really, really good trailers,
Yeah. And that can often happen, I would say, more often than not in the high grades, like the Jumai Daiganjo,
that's
the
interesting.
Daiganjos, because
Yeah.
they are produced to have super high tone aromas, gorgeous, glamorous aromas, and then you confirm in the mouth, and it's
A
hollow,
little bit of disappointment.
empty. It's got a bit of a bitter finish.
Yeah.
It's not delivering what the promise was.
But that can actually be rated quite highly in Japan. So having this like really, really, really over the top aroma and then like following it with nothing can sometimes be rated quite highly here.
It depends what the nothing is.
It
If
does,
if the nothing is empty,
Yeah.
then that's not highly rated.
No. Just clean and kind of simple as opposed
Clean
to
and simple is fine
It's
as long
fine.
as on the palate and the secondary aromas are also complementary to that simple expression on the palate. Then you could probably get away with it. And generally, I don't recall a sake that's completely disjointed between aroma and palate receiving very high praise. That's just in the competitions that I've worked
They get
on.
chucked out early on, don't they? You kind of not chucked out. You kind of rule them out.
There's a lot of
early on.
great sake to choose from.
Yeah. So we've been talking a lot about like this kind of first aroma that you come across, and then that kind of gives you an idea of what the sake is going to taste like. So in Japanese, they actually separate the aromas, and they have different names for them. So the aroma that kind of wafts out of the glass, the first thing that you actually smell is called the uadachi ka in Japanese, and it literally means like the glass that kind of floats. The aroma that floats out of the glass. And then you have the aroma that you detect in the mouth, which we the flavor basically, which in Japanese is called the kochuka or fukumika. Literally means, again, aroma in the mouth. And then finally you have this kind of, sometimes when you swallow the sake and you get this kind of little return aroma sometimes. They have a word for that as well, which is modorika. So when you actually go and you do a professional tasting here in Japan, they might refer to those a little bit. We don't have anything like that. Well, we do kind of in English as well, don't we? You have like the mid-palate aromas and...
Well, you would have like the after aroma.
Yeah, after aroma. Yeah.
The aroma on the palate.
Yeah.
I think it's fairly similar.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the same in wine, I'm pretty sure.
So for those of you listening who...
Wine
perhaps
people
aren't-
might want to send us a message if
Yeah.
we've got it wrong.
Yeah. So where do most of the aroma... Well, what type of aroma should we expect to find in sake? And so I actually did some research, and first of all, the National Research Institute of Brewing give a very simple breakdown of the kind of aromas that you would expect to find in sake. And they've kind of broken it down into 8 categories. Going to read them out. So you've got apple, banana, alcohol, vinegar, soy sauce / caramel, Japanese pickles. There's a type of pickle called takuan, with sulfurous flavors, and then rice koji, and finally wood and grass. They do actually, have to say, provide a much more detailed breakdown in the form of a flavor wheel, which is not possible to show you, but we'll put up on the website to accompany this podcast. Now, if you actually compare the amount of aromas that you pick up in wine, there are much less aromas for sake than there are for wine. A lot less, actually.
Actually, sometimes the uwadachika is
Yeah.
a big question mark when you get the glass close to your nose and you're trying to appreciate the aromas that, what expression do you use?
A
That float?
wafting from the
Wafting.
glass.
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the word. Wafting out of the glass.
Yeah.
I am struggling.
I have a really recently developed an analogy for this myself after doing a bit of wine tasting, taking the WSET wine course. I think if you compare with wine, I would say wine speaks quite loudly to you. And with sake, you really need to listen really hard. It speaks in quite a quiet voice. The flavors or aromas are very subtle, I would say, compared to wine.
But that's so Japanese. It's so Japanese that the aroma would be sort of ephemeral, sort of a little bit like sakura that comes for just such a short time and delights us and then slowly fades away. I mean, that's in some ways what we're describing, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's what makes it so charming, is that we can't ever quite grasp it.
Yours was definitely more poetic than mine.
Understated smells.
Yes, indeed. But that's what we're dealing with here. For a lot of people, I think, as Rebekah was saying earlier, the aroma can kind of just smell the same from sake to sake.
Well, that's the misconception.
That's the
That was
misconception.
my
though.
point.
That's the misconception.
People often ask me, how do I drink sake? Number one, my answer is just drink it.
Yeah.
And then number two, trust your senses. That's the most important thing. I think when people approach sake, they think, oh, I'm not supposed to know what the aromas of sake are because I don't know anything about sake. You've got a nose. You've got flavor memories and aroma memories. If it smells like your grandmother's perfume, it smells like your grandmother's perfume. If it smells like banana cake with raisins, that's what it smells like to you. So I do believe that we should also preface what we're saying with, in some ways, when it comes to our senses, there's no right or wrong. Trust yourself, trust your palate, trust your sense of aroma and the memories that you have, and then slowly use that as your building block from which to expand your knowledge and awareness of sake's aromas.
I think that definitely works. But, when I first actually started tasting sake, or maybe when I go and visit a brewery, then they bring out all these different sake and I'd be tasting them, and I'd try and make tasting notes so I could remember what they tasted like, later. And I'd come to the aroma. I'd always struggle, and perhaps it's because I don't have a very good vocabulary when it comes to aroma. I think that's also really important, right? So I know I'm picking up something very familiar. I just wouldn't be able to put a word to it. And it was really frustrating, actually, because, you're like, how am I going to remember this? I've got to find something. And you end up just writing the same thing. Oh, well, it's fruity.
Well, that's why I encourage people to talk about things that are really familiar to them, things that are easy to recall.
Yeah.
For example, it might smell like, I had a sake during IWC, the judging competition, that smelled like the tomatoes that my mum used to bring in from the garden. And it was a Jumai Daiganjo. There shouldn't have probably been any tomatoes in that round, but it was the tomato stalk from those warm tomatoes that she brought in from the garden during summer.
Yeah.
That was my note.
I'm so jealous when I hear that, because it just doesn't come to my, I think I must be just, there's nothing up there as far as that's concerned. No memories connected to aroma or anything.
Well, you can also, this is just a little bit of a tip, is you can also, if you are wanting to bump up your ability to recall aromas, start today. Go to the supermarket, go into the produce section, pick up a broccoli, smell that. What does that smell like? Go and pick up an apple now. Go and pick up a melon, a peach.
Yeah.
Start smelling everything. The flowers that they have wrapped up near the door.
Yeah.
Start smelling your pickles.
Just keep going until they throw you out.
No, you buy the stuff first, hopefully. You don't open up the packets. But you just, I think your home is one of the best laboratories to start your aroma exploration, especially your kitchen.
Yeah.
Just start smelling everything. Like, for me, often I use the expression of, when you get natural yogurt and it sits in the refrigerator for a while and that layer of water kind of settles on the top of the yogurt.
Oh, yeah.
Often sake's got that aroma, especially if it's like a Kimoto style or a Yamahai style. It will sometimes have that kind of watery lactic acid aroma, a little bit powdery as well, a little bit of got a bit of yogurt in it. I describe it as Meiji Bulgaria yogurt water. That's what I describe it as. You've got when you're talking about sake, you don't have to be a professional, but just as long as it connects to a true aroma memory for you is really key.
Well, definitely practice helps.
Practice, and practice, and just kind of I think it helps to have a few building blocks though, so that you do actually know what you're kind of picking up. And so I think what we'll do is we'll go through the type of aromas that you would expect to find in sake, and then we'll have a look at the sort of the history of aroma. First of all, in modern day sake especially, maybe not so much more traditional sake or sake from a bygone age, but certainly modern sake and more recent sake, you would expect to find in the ginjo style sake, you would expect to find a kind of fruity or floral aroma. Yeah,
indeed.
More so fruity.
Usually these days, quite in your face.
Yeah, can be, can't it? It's not for everyone, and also it depends. Like you were saying, it depends on the overall kind of structure of the sake as well. It doesn't suit all types of sake. But when you come across that sake that has that perfect, fruity aroma. It's just glorious, like, tropical fruits, but really restrained, not too over the top. It really is quite something, isn't it? The reason that you get banana or apple in a sake, despite sake not being made with either apples or bananas, is because it contains something that both apples and bananas contain, and that's something called an ester. And we're going to talk about how those are actually produced later on. That's the simple answer. And where did these esters come from? They come from the yeast, basically. It's the yeast that produces these. I have to say also that esters are not unique to sake, right? You also get them in beer and in wine. I think they're more natural in the case of wine, but you also get them in wine. All food, basically.
Flavorings come
Products,
from
yeah.
esters.
Yeah.
So, for example, a common aroma that I pick up in competition, Junmai Daiginjo, and in some like Junmai Ginjos as well, is there's candied bananas that you used to get as children, and I often pick up that. And why do I pick up that? Because the ester is exactly the same.
Yeah. And also, esters are found in perfume as well. You actually read the back of the bottles of some perfumes that actually list the esters on there.
Your toilet spray.
Toilet spray as
Lots
well.
of esters.
Yeah. Actually, as a question to you both, because I couldn't actually find the answer to this. I'm presuming it's probably esters, or perhaps esters that haven't been created in their entirety, kind of like half-created esters or whatever. But baked fruit aromas, where do you think they kind of come from? Is it sort of sake with esters and then maybe something else?
Well, often when I've experienced particularly I would say probably Junmai Ginjo or a Junmai Daiginjo, Ginjo, that has got a baked fruit aroma, then usually if it is also connected with a slightly off-balance palate, I would say that sake has been exposed to some kind of temperature damage, and the beautiful light fruity aromas have possibly gone through accelerated aging. But that is something that I would probably suspect on the nose, as if it was a Junmai Ginjo or a Daiginjo. Big baked fruit aromas could indicate for me temperature damage, but I would confirm that on the palate.
In the case of wine, kind of baked fruit is not always seen as a positive, right? It can be a sign of sort of the wine being past its best, or for me, it's indicative of something is possibly not right. Yeah.
And I need to confirm that on the palate just to see what that is, whether it's temperature damage or whether it's been it's oxidized.
Yeah.
Open too long. Something's not right, or it could very well be fine on the palate, like expressing no faults on the palate. It could just be that particular brewery style. Yeah. I would definitely put a question mark next to it. If it was something like maybe an aged Junmai Ginjo, I might be expecting that, and it was labeled as such, I might be expecting that.
You do get it in just on a very kind of just faint sort of baked fruit aromas. And sometimes it can actually be your own sense of smell as well. You're picking what you think is baked banana, but actually it's something completely different. So, Sebastian.
Well, I mean, make a slightly different answer, but for me the answer is the baked fruit aroma comes from as the same origin as the other aromas. It's just an organic or a chemical compound of sake. That's and maybe the point I want to make here is what we were talking about earlier, the difference between the primary and secondary aromas, which is a discussion that people often have about wine, and that we almost do not have about sake. My understanding is that sake is mostly made of, or the aromas of sake are mostly secondary or tertiary aromas, and that there are very, very few primary aromas in sake.
Yeah, because nothing actually comes kind of naturally, really, from the rice. What you're getting from the rice is maybe rice, right? There aren't really any other aromas that rice can produce on its own, right? And that's the big difference between rice and grapes, isn't it?
And honestly, I don't have the answer to that question. I don't know if the ricey aromas or that we get from the sake are primary aromas sometimes, or secondary aromas as well, i.e. coming from the yeast working its way through the moromi.
I just put in here that if you do pick up any kind of like non-fresh fruit aromas, what I mean by that, like when you leave a kind of glass of orange juice out for too long, the kind of smell that you get from that after a few hours, you can sometimes pick that up in sake. That's normally a sign, I think, of oxidation. Cereal aromas, I think, generally come from the proteins on the rice when they're actually dissolved into the moromi, into the fermentation. I don't think starch on its own can actually create aroma. So it's kind of when it's broken down, that's when that actually happens. Basically imparting aromas into the fermentation. Floral and spice, although you can also get floral with esters as well. Floral and spice can actually be alcohol or aldehyde. Too much of this in sake is generally a bad thing. Especially if you get this kind of like spicy beer aromas, that can be a sign that something's not quite right. Woody, kind of grassy green aromas, I think is generally a product of something called acetylaldehyde. If you get it into high levels, you end up with volatile acidity. And could also be actually, if it's a woody aroma, it could be a fault. As in they've been using some like wooden tools in the brewing, and that's the aromas from the tools have actually been accidentally imparted into the sake. Or it could be purposeful. They could have actually stored the sake in a wooden vessel. Like they have a type of sake called taruzake, where the sake is stored in cedar. This is a very kind of traditional type of sake used in celebrations. That will have a very kind of woody aroma, but that's purposeful.
Most often than not, I find that when you get a green woody note, it's usually because the first thing I'll ask a brewer is, have you changed anything in the kojimuro recently? Right. So it could be that they've relined the kojimuro or the koji making room with new wood. Sometimes there will be that woody. I describe it as like an onsen or like a Japanese onsen bath kind of aroma. And sometimes it can even be, one brewery had it that note on the nose, which was uncharacteristic for the brewer. And I said, has anything happened in the kojimuro? And they said, oh yeah, we brought in a new table. So just one table had been brought in, and it had imparted a really distinct like aroma on that batch, and the next 3 years of their sake had that very green woody note. Yeah, takes about 3 years for it to settle down.
Okay, Rebekah, when you mentioned the smell of the bath, you didn't mean the water, you meant the bathtub. Is that right?
The bathtub, but basically when you walk into the bathroom, it's warm. And the aroma is sort of, it's also got a sort of a moist kind of
moldy almost, maybe.
It's moist.
Moist, okay.
It's, if anyone's ever walked into an onsen, you know what it's not a dry. For me, it's often not a dry green woodiness. It's a kind of a moist, damp woodiness. Okay. I would say.
Generally, not a positive thing to pick up on a sake, but you know.
Yeah. It can be compelling. It depends what floats your boat.
How they use it, how they kind of work it into the overall sake itself. Next one, soy sauce or kind of caramel aromas. Normally, unless anyone wants to interject and say otherwise, I think this is a product of the actual aging of the sake. It's going through something called the Maillard reaction. Kind of amino acids are breaking down, sugars are breaking down, and you get this thing called, I don't think it's an ester, I think it's a lactone called Salon, and it kind of smells like caramel or soy sauce or honey. In nice situations, honey. And also as well, you've got umami as well, I think, as well in there. Actually, there's the question of whether umami is actually an aroma or a taste, a flavor or a taste, and I think it'd be both. We had this discussion a little bit in the Riedel interview, which is episode 19 and 20.
Savory. Something can smell savory.
Right.
So I would consider, but then again, you could describe savory in much more detail.
You could.
Savory is a kind of all-encompassing general word, but I could probably break it down into it smells like Marmite on toast or miso or
definitely,
something.
Marmite.
So perhaps it's more of like an all-encompassing word to describe aroma group.
Yeah. And just like Marmite, you either kind of you love it or you hate it, don't you, when it comes to these kind of.
What do you think,
aged wines?
Sebastian?
Yeah, what do you think, Sebastian?
I don't eat a lot of them on Marmite.
Oh no.
But actually, I do like the smell.
Okay.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, for me, umami is an excitement of my senses,
Yeah.
and it makes me salivate.
Mm.
So I can definitely think. I would say that
Mm.
umami has a smell.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. So soy sauce and caramel, that's where you get those from, if you're ever wondering. Vinegar, I think generally that's not a positive thing. Basically, if your sake is turned to vinegar, which is, these days is not going to happen so often because of the high alcohol levels. But basically, it's a reaction between bad bacteria and producing acetic acid.
I find I experience it most in sparkling sake, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah. That's because of bacterial problem with that sparkling sake,
Okay.
basically. But especially because some sparkling sake is very sweet.
Okay.
And there can be some kind of secondary fermentation, and
Going on there.
before long you've got a sake vinaigrette.
That's right. So when the sake is stable, it's not going to keep fermenting. Nothing's really going to change in there. But if it keeps fermenting, then you could possibly have production of other kind of things in there, which produces this acetic acid. Japanese pickles. That's another. Quite a lot of these are negative, actually, once you actually realize. But Japanese pickles. This is kind of another one of those. You either like them or you hate them type thing.
Yeah. I do remember being told by someone that when I experienced a sake that had DTMS or hineka, or a off-aromed sake, that was what real sake smelt like. And basically it was someone who had a very strong opinion about the sake that they liked, and tried to tell me that, good sake smells like this. And my response was, well, this sake smells like this, but I don't really believe in good and bad sake.
Yeah.
So this sake smells like this, and I'll just leave it at that. But I do think that sometimes I have heard, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. I have heard people who are particularly passionate about a particular style of sake being quite down on the pretty floral aromas that are in some sake, because it's seen as maybe not being real, true, pure sake. I believe that all sake is genuinely real and pure, given the way that it's produced and the precision and the quality and the care with which sake is made. I think that there is a huge spectrum of aromas, as I said before, and everyone has got a place that they vibe on. So if someone enjoys the more rustic aroma of hineka sake or a namihine, like I told you before, I used to really enjoy namihine, then that's fabulous. I don't like to get into this thing of like there are good and bad aromas too much.
That's fair. Very fair.
But I think it's important to understand what the aromas are.
Definitely. So it is important, I think, to say that generally here in Japan, the pickle aroma tends to be picked up quite negatively. And this is one reason why generally namazake is not kind of aged, because that you have this DMTS and it just doesn't...
I think that a lot of people think that is what namazake
smells like, yeah.
And especially outside of Japan. I think, because I've actually never had a namazake that was in good condition on the nose overseas. There was some level of oxidization creeping in, or some kind of accelerated aging notes.
And that's just because it's the time it's taken for it to actually...
The time it's taken to export it, the temperature with which it was exported, and various other little black holes of temperature control, or lack thereof, that mean that sake has... It's like the sake has been in the sun without sunscreen for a long time.
Okay. Oh, that's good. Yeah. So there you go. Japanese pickles in namazake, not necessarily a desirable thing. The musty smell that you sometimes get from sake can be, again, well, we've already talked about this with the koji just a second ago, so that's what that is. But you do also get really pleasant aromas from the koji. Now, people pick this up differently. I always pick it up as kind of like a chestnut aroma, but it comes from the tokomomi stage, one of the first stages of the koji making process. We kind of spread the rice out to encourage the mold growth. And so you get this really nice chestnut aroma. And anyone who's actually visited a brewery and gone into the koji room will have maybe picked up this aroma. You get a lot of chestnut in Namazake, actually, for some reason. It can be quite strong. Yogurt and cheese. We love this one because, this is all about the yeast starter stage of the sake making process. And it's generally produced by lactic acid bacteria. No surprise there when you think how yogurt and essentially dairy products are made. Funky aromas, mushroom, cloves, meat, what you would maybe refer to as tertiary aromas in the case of wine, are generally produced by the wild bacteria in the Yamahai process. Problem here is we've not actually talked about what the Yamahai process is in any of our previous episodes. Basically, it's producing, so the yeast starter is where you're actually growing the yeast into a healthy population that can kind of defend itself against other wild bacteria and actually obviously drive the fermentation. And because the tank is open in the case of sake, you will have wild bacteria trying to come in and spoil the party. And the Kimoto and Yamahai process is basically you protect the yeast while it's growing using natural bacteria. Basically, this lactic acid bacteria can produce these kind of yogurt or cheese aromas and also quite funky aromas as well. Because in the Yamahai process, the wild bacteria does actually get into the tank, and you leave it there just long enough for it to produce these kind of funky aromas, which, are not to everyone's taste, but some people do like them.
It happened that I had a sake last night, which had a very, very strong butter aroma.
Okay.
Like a very natural way of making sake by one of the famous Chiba brewers.
Okay.
And I believe in that case, the aromas were coming from the main fermentation as well.
Okay.
But it can give, these lactic aromas, I definitely agree with you, often come from that yeast starter, but they can get really, really strong and take us to bitter and to butter. Sorry.
Butter is great, but actually butter can sometimes be diacetyl, which can be something a little bit nastier. Maybe something's gone wrong in the fermentation. But butter is good in sake in general. And that's kind of it, really, I think, isn't it? Sometimes you get some bready aromas which come from the yeast when you've left sort of the fine lees in the sake. Especially, I think, with sparkling sake, just like with champagne, you get quite bready aromas. There are some other negative aromas which it might be worth to talk about when you've had some kind of light damage. So generally, when the sake should be kept away from sunlight and UV light. But if it has come into contact with either of those, you might get a kind of burnt hair or animal kind of aroma, which isn't particularly pleasant. And if you ever pick up egg, sulfury aromas in the sake, that's definitely not a good sign. That's normally something called hyochi, a bacteria called hyochi, which has completely spoiled the sake. But that's rare these days.
You mentioned animal, and it actually reminds me that I wanted to, when you were talking about Yamahai, talk of the gamey profile, aroma profile of some of the Yamahai sake. And then clearly it's not an effect. It's I enjoy it quite a lot. This subtle leather or game aroma.
Yeah. And that basically comes from that wild bacteria.
And it's very rare, but we sometimes get defects from the packaging itself. So plastic, for example, may come from the packaging of the sake, which can be mentioned as well.
Yeah. So sadly, Rebekah has had to leave us, go off to a sake event and go and entertain some people and bring them into the world of sake. But we'll continue this discussion, right, Sebastian?
That's right.
Okay. So I guess one other thing that we should talk about that maybe our listeners are wondering was one of the first things I wondered actually when I first tasted sake. Did it always taste like this? So historically, how has sake changed? What would sake have smelled like 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago? Sebastian, do you have any ideas? How do you think it would have? What's your kind of? How do you imagine sake smelling 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago?
For most people who enter the sake world today, these fruity aromas we were talking about earlier, this so-called ginjoka, is sort of, a given or something they're looking for. But for a number of reasons, they were not in sake 500 years ago.
That's right.
Because they are the result of a very specific brewing process.
Yeah.
So how did it smell like? Well,
well, I actually found a kind of tasting notes for a sake which a brewery made based on an old Edo period. So that's sort of like 17th to 18th century. Basically, this brewery created a sake based on an old Edo period recipe. And they described, the person who was actually writing the tasting notes described this sake as smelling like soy sauce.
Wow.
Yeah.
Like to try?
Well, actually, I can understand that because I did a bit of research. And first of all, in the Edo period, so this is kind of slightly this is the period where they started to brew using the 3-stage fermentation process. They started to use pasteurization on a large scale. And they started brewing sake in the winter as well, in the colder months, because originally sake was being brewed all year round. And the actual only reason they changed that is because the government told them to. I think that's my understanding. But anyway, so basically, my understanding of this research kind of suggests that, first of all, they were putting ash in the sake. There's something called aku mochizake. Okay, so they were putting ash in the fermentation. And it says that by putting ash in the fermentation, it actually gave the sake a very... an aroma that reminds you of mirin, or a mirin-esque aroma. And with regards to the soy sauce, I think probably my guess would be that it's because the sake was aging. Yeah, not being stored like it is today with refrigerated storage, maybe.
I would think so as well. Because this aroma of soy sauce we pick up from aged sake a lot.
So we were talking about earlier, right?
Tertiary aroma.
Exactly. Yeah. And they used to actually water the sake down because you couldn't drink it. It was that rich and the aroma was that strong. Can you imagine trying to drink soy sauce? Not particularly pleasant. So what they were doing is, I don't think it was the brewers, but the shops were actually watering the sake down. That would take the alcohol level down to around 5%. So then you would have something that's a bit like a beer almost. And then the problem with the lack of alcohol is that it's then vulnerable to acetic acid, production of acetic acid, or basically just, going bad. So I don't have a very positive image of sake back in the Edo period. I hope that's wrong, but I think probably that was the case. And if we look at pre-war versus post-war, I think there's a period after the war where the aroma of sake got quite bad, because they were adding lots of different things to the sake to basically so that they could sell the volume required, because they had a lack of rice, so they couldn't actually produce the volume. And I don't know what they were adding, but they were adding all sorts of things like extra alcohol, sweetening agents, whatever. And apparently, I think this created quite a bad aroma.
You're mentioning sort of bad things here, or things that have a bad reputation today.
That's right.
But a very important point is that in fact, while the yeast is producing most of the aromas, as we said.
That's right.
So at the end of the fermentation period, the tanks, the sake in the tank has a number of esters that will create these aromas.
Yeah.
And still, the brewer has means to play with that aromatic profile and that bouquet of the sake, and by adding at least one or two things, or two things. Alcohol, distilled alcohol.
They could add alcohol,
which will stabilize the mash and fix some of these esters and aromas.
That's right.
And the other thing is water, because as you add water to the mash, so you're watering down the sake contained in the tank, you are changing the concentration of the molecules that make these esters. So you might bring certain aromas below your perception level.
Yeah.
So that's a way to
So-
refine the aromatic profile.
So in
as
other
well.
words, this watering down that they were doing early on may actually have been diluting potential esters that were there. So perhaps esters already existed in sake. They were always there. It's just that the brewing process wasn't designed to enhance them or bring them out. They were almost being snubbed out, if you like, during the fermentation. If we go back to the Edo period, especially in kind of like the Kansai area of Japan, in the south of Japan, in a lot of places, they were actually using hard water to brew the sake, which is very high in mineral content, which drives the fermentation. So you get a very fast fermentation, you get a very aggressive fermentation, you get a very aggressive breakdown of starch to sugar and then sugar to alcohol. But in Hiroshima, they actually have soft water. And a problem that they had was because the soft water doesn't contain many minerals, you still had quite a fast breakdown of starch to sugar. You still had quite a fast enzymatic reaction between, I mean, if you were brewing at high temperatures, right? So let's assume that they were brewing at around, say, 18 degrees or something like that. You get a very fast breakdown. Well, it would be a normal breakdown of starch to sugar, but the yeast is not able to keep up with that breakdown. So what you end up with is a lot of sugar in the fermentation, which produces a lot of acidity, a lot of volatile acidity, and it can, in some cases, actually end up with a spoiled batch, something called fuso in Japanese. And this was a big problem in Hiroshima. And they were brewing in quite warm temperatures. Well, I mean, it's quite warm in Hiroshima if you compare it with, say, Niigata or somewhere like that. Brewers in Hiroshima had to devise a process whereby they could produce sake with low mineral soft water. And basically what they did was they lowered the temperature of the fermentation. But by doing that, they actually produced an environment that was very difficult for the yeast to survive. And when the yeast has to work harder to survive, it produces these higher alcohols, which are the precursors for the esters that we talked about earlier. So this is where the ginjo process came from. So we're talking about the ginjo process. So ginjo actually started off being called ginzo. Ginjo does not, in Japanese, the meaning of the word ginjo does not have anything to do with fruity or floral aromas. Ginjo literally means precision brewing. That's how you would translate it. So the original word ginzo literally means precision brewing. And then in 1984, a brewery in Niigata just decided to, I don't know why, but decided to start using the word ginjo, and then it stuck, basically. And that's the history of the word ginjo. So Yamada Nishiki doesn't come along until much later, but the development of rice to actually aid with the production of these esters, with these ginjo aromas, is definitely key as well.
I think if I want to take it to the simplest level, is one characteristic of the ginjo method beyond the temperature control is the polishing of the rice.
That's right.
And we can establish some rough correlation between the level of fruity aromas and the polishing ratio of the rice.
That's exactly correct. The outside layers of the rice contain fats and lipids, which actually inhibit the creation of esters. And what about the koji as well? So when we actually produce ginjo, one key part of the process is actually making a koji with less mold growth. So basically less enzymes are going to be imparted in the fermentation. And again, that means that there's going to be a slower breakdown of starch to sugar and there's going to be less nutrients for the yeast. A ginjo has only been around for the last, 80 years, maybe, less than that. And pretty much when we got the vertical polishing machines to polish the rice, before we had those, we couldn't polish the rice down to sufficient enough levels to be able to actually pull off this ginjo production process.
I think ginjo has become mainstream for in a much more recent past.
Yes.
And that goes in tandem with the preferences of consumers and the efforts of producers, of brewers, to create new products for a market that has been declining.
Yeah.
And it goes in tandem as well with the development of the identification or the cultivation of new yeast.
Yes.
Doesn't it?
And that's where we need to go next, right? traditionally, brewers were just basically using wild yeast. Sometimes they would produce really good results. You would get nice aromas from them, but it wasn't consistent. You couldn't produce that result the next year because the yeast is, you have to isolate that part, that particular yeast strain to be able to produce that again. So the Society of Brewing in Japan, they created basically a proprietary yeast called a Kyokai Kobo. And it's what most brewers use today to brew sake. So basically, they come in these little ampules. You only need a small ampule to actually brew, a batch of sake. I would like to briefly just talk about the evolution of these Kyokai Kobos. So they go all the way back to the 1900s. That's when kind of the first Kyokai Kobo were created. And basically what happened, so you would have like a sake competition, and one of the scientists from this society would go along and often judge or maybe taste the sake. And whenever they came across a particular aroma that they found interesting, they would go and investigate the brewery that created this aroma. And then they would perhaps be able to isolate the yeast in that brewery. And that's how these proprietary yeast came about. So a lot of the proprietary yeast that are used today, the Kyokai Kobo that are used today, were actually discovered in particular sake breweries. So to give you an example, number 6 was discovered in Aramas in Akita Prefecture. And number 7, which is arguably the standard used by nearly all breweries in Japan, because it produces such consistent results and a nice aroma as well, was discovered at Masumi, Miyasaka Jozo, in Nagano, in Suwa in Nagano.
And you can refer to our interview.
Yeah, we had an interview with Masumi where they talked about the number 7 yeast. We actually talked about that. Number 7 is, it just keeps working. It just keeps brewing. No matter what you do, no matter what happens to the environment in the fermentation, you can rely on it to just keep fermenting away. And it produces these amazing aromas as well. You get banana, apple, things like that. Now, the first kind of stage, if we see stage 1 of the Kyokai Kobo, which were developed between 1900 and 1945, really just focused on consistency and reliability. They weren't really concerned too much about aroma. Then, in between 1960 and 1980, in stage 2, the demand for yeast that produce these higher alcohols, the precursors for esters, grew because of competition, basically. I don't think there was any other reason apart from competitions. And then we have the creation or the discovery of number 9 and number 10, which I think are arguably the most important yeast during this period. Number 9 was discovered by Koro in Kumamoto Prefecture. Discovered at Koro and I think developed at the Kumamoto Research Institute. And number 10 was discovered at Meiri Shuzo in Ibaraki. Very similar, actually, aren't they? They both produce a very strong kind of tropical fruits aroma, candied fruits aroma.
They are definitely responsible for most of the ginjos and daiginjos that we see in the market today.
Do you like number 9 and number 10? Because it can be quite divisive, can't they? Among the among the tasting population, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly like some of the sakes that they're producing.
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I enjoy these fruity aromas.
And stage 3, much more recently, from about the 90s to the present day, the focus has been on reducing the acidity, because the acidity is quite high of like number 9 and number 10. So the focus has been on reducing the acidity, I assume, so that the aromas can kind of show themselves a bit more. One problem that you have with these later yeast, which we're talking about numbers 1601, 1801, 1901, for example, they tend to produce quite a strong bitterness, I find. Can you relate to that?
Yeah. What I relate to is, or was, the necessity to work on the yeast and try maybe other things, because in my personal experience, some of the daiginjos that you may find on the market, you open the bottle on day 1 and you enjoy this beautiful fruity thing, and you put it in the fridge, and the following morning, a number of aromas are gone, sometimes most of the aromas are gone, right. And you're left with something which is just quite acidic.
Yeah.
And so some of these daiginjos are, how can I describe them? Are a
Fragile.
very difficult, fragile.
Yeah.
They're a difficult exercise trying to keep balance between the sweetness that will limit this bitter taste of the acids or alcohol, and these aromatic esters that are present in the sake.
And I think some breweries have started to actually blend the later yeast with the stage 2 yeast, number 9 and number 10, to kind of balance out that bitterness. So you were talking about having to store the daiginjo or ginjo they're very fragile, have to store them carefully. I have to point out, I think a lot of people would be tempted to use the vacuum suckers, the vacuum seal
that's a good point,
pumps. Don't use them for ginjo and daiginjo, because what you'll actually be doing is sucking out the alcohol, the higher alcohols, and just leaving this caproic acid behind, which is not the nice part of the ethyl caprate ester. It's almost kind of like goat fur, goatish. It's quite animally, isn't it? It can be almost like a damp dishcloth in some cases. So, yeah. Also, as well, don't leave the top off your bottle of ginjo or daiginjo, because then it will evaporate. The higher alcohols will evaporate and just leave you with this.
I mean, many of them may still be perfectly drinkable, but we'll sometimes losing the magic of the first moment.
That's right. So, okay, we're coming towards the end of the show. Like we said right at the beginning, I mean, sake doesn't have as much aroma as wine, really. I mean, it still has quite a large spectrum of aroma, but they're much more subtle, much more difficult to kind of detect. I mean, with wine, it's a massive thing, aroma. Could we say the same thing about sake? And what are the demerits and merits of putting aroma in sake? Sebastie?
I mean, developing the aromatic dimension of sake has contributed to this great diversity of products that we see in the market. So I think that aromas are a differentiation method, a way for producers to differentiate themselves in this market. So that's a definite merit for them and a different merit for the consumer. But another what is good about aromas is, as Rebekah was saying earlier, it's a promise. So it's the beginning of the enjoyment of the sake, of the drink.
It's the window dressing, isn't it?
The window dressing.
Yeah, before you walk into the shop and you actually enjoy the sake. I would say perhaps a merit and a demerit is when it comes to pairing with food. Having aroma, like with wine, sometimes if you have aromas of a particular, say, for example, banana, apple, or spice, or herbs, or things like that, when it comes to pairing with the food, you can actually look for food which has similar flavors in it. And then, you will create kind of like a congruent pairing or a complementary pairing. The demerit there is that aroma can actually restrict the food pairing. You're really not going to have many good results trying to pair a very, very strong daiginjo or ginjo with sushi, sashimi, for example, right? You're not going to be able to enjoy the freshness of the fish.
Agreed, with exception. And this is a very good point. And we were mentioning earlier about the number of sake references where you have a low level of aromas, which which again is related to the fact that these sakes are not necessarily not as good, but they are just built or thought of to be maybe better pairings or more versatile pairing for a diverse range of foods.
Yeah, and it's definitely a lot of it is a lot of like the increase in aroma in kind of modern times is definitely influenced by the food pairing as well, I think. The food that you're pairing with. And also, there's been a lot of influence from the wine world as well, I think. We don't want to say too much because we already had this ginjo aroma going back before, brewers started dabbling in the wine world. But there's definitely some influence there. I think, to sum up, I think, aroma can be a big part of the tasting experience of discovering sake. Maybe for some people, it's more about the aroma than it is what you actually taste on the tongue. But go out there, like Rebekah said, just explore, and what you can actually pick up on the nose, go with it. Just write down what you get. Make these stories, if it reminds you of a particular memory, as Aroma quite often can do, from your childhood, for example, go with that. Put that in your tasting notes. And we'll definitely come back to this topic in future podcasts, because we definitely haven't nailed it in this one, I don't think. But today, that's what we'll leave you with.
Actually, Chris, before we end, because we started describing the beautiful aromas of a Ginjo or a Daiginjo sake, I just don't want to leave our listeners with the idea that a sake that does not have these aromas or does not show these aromas when you first pick up the glass is not as good or has nothing to offer, because we discussed it a little, but in the history of sake, sake has not always been aromatic, and
I don't think sake necessarily has to kind of shout at you to make itself heard.
That's
right?
That's a good way of saying it.
It's almost kind of, it can whisper to you, right? And it can still be whispering something very magical. You just have to kind of strain your ears maybe to hear it. Actually, when I first started tasting sake, I think there were a lot of sake I kind of just put to one side and thought, nah, this doesn't, it's boring almost, just from that one impression. But now when I come across those really restrained aromatic sake, I actually do really appreciate them, especially when it's all balanced nicely with the rest of the profile. Hopefully, although I think we've only really touched the surface of when it comes to aroma, but hopefully we've kind of provided the foundation to talk about this again in future episodes. Thank you very much, Rebekah.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Sebastian. Lovely
Thank you
to
very
talk
much
with
to you
you
both.
and to share a little bit of information with you all. Fairly broad subject, but get in touch with us if you have any further questions, if you wanted to point out something or share your thoughts or ideas, or even have an amazing sake aroma story that you want to share with us. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you very much.
And I'm looking forward to seeing you sniffing in your supermarket, as Rebekah was hinting at the best method to train one's nose. And I mean, you're doing a great job as sake judge, so I guess you went through that.
Yep, yeah. I made people stop and stare and question why that crazy foreign girl had her face in the grapes. Do it. Be embarrassed, but be polite and pay for things if you touch them.
You sniffing through a supermarket, and I've got you with in a style, kind of Rocky style montage with the Rocky music behind, and you're training your face for the judging.
I'm not sure if it was that intense, but anyway.
Thanks very much, Rebekah, Sebastian, and as always, we'll continue to bring you more interesting stories from the world of sake, more insight, and generally just try and make this sometimes quite complicated beverage a little bit more accessible and understandable.
And that's the end of the show. Thank you so much for listening. Sake on Air is made with the generous support of the Japan Sake and Shochu Makers Association and is broadcast from the Japan Sake and Shochu Information Center in Tokyo. The show is a co-production between Export Japan and Pot-Sake Productions. If you feel like Sake on Air contributed something to your enjoyment of sake and shochu this past year, please take a moment to rate and review us on whatever service you use to listen to podcasts. If you want to give back to the Sake on Air team, it's really the best way to do it. Also, please keep sending us your questions and comments about the show. You can send them to questions@sakeonair.com, or you can DM us on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook @sakeonair. Happy New Year, everyone! Kanpai!